Transformation Transformation by Christian Skoorsmith.
Introduction. Another self-help book? Really? Look, I know what you might be thinking, because I've been there too. I've rolled my eyes and thought, this book has something to say that no one else has ever said? This book is going to make the difference? To be honest, I'm pretty sure everything in this book has already existed before I thought it or wrote it down. But the reality is, you are here right now with this book in your hands for a reason. I don't know what that reason is. You may not even know consciously what that reason is. But we are here together at this moment for a reason. So let's just take a moment. You have a mind, a beautiful mind, a mind that has extraordinary power to shape your life. It is already shaping your life. You behave the way you do, respond or react the way you do, move the way you do, speak the way you do, because you have a mind that has been shaped by experiences and insights throughout your life. You are as successful as you are right now because of your incredible mind. But maybe your mind is also holding you back in some ways. Perhaps a habit, or a habitual reaction, or a nagging imposter syndrome, or a fear, or worry, or stress. Maybe you're simply interested in how to make yourself even better. Then this little book might be a good place to start. We take a quick dip into the psychology of why our minds are predisposed to not change, why change is sometimes, or oftentimes, difficult, and how we can actually take advantage of that. Then we lay into how the subconscious works on a fundamental level. Once we've laid the groundwork, we go in two opposite directions. First, touring the dynamics of fear and how that grows. But then secondly, flipping that around to see an example of how that same dynamic holds tremendous personal and interpersonal hope. Finally, I walk through a simple and effective way to do transformational trance work yourself as soon as you close the book and close your eyes. Now, if you want to, you can just skip to the last chapter and get started right away. That's fine. I think you'll be interested in learning more about how this whole thing works, whether before you start deliberately shaping your life or after. You don't need to know how it works or why it works. You can just experience it working. But why not know the how and the why too? And I add to the end of this book some advice about looking for a professional hypnotist. Sometimes it helps to have professional help, and some guidance for what to look for might be useful. Hypnosis is a broad-ranging modality that I have found to be profoundly helpful in my own life and in the lives of my clients. I really believe in hypnosis when it's well done by a skilled and ethical professional. The task is to find such a person. In this short, quick introduction to you, I offer a peek under the hood, so to speak, at the mechanisms and dynamics that drive your engine. It's a how-to for programming yourself for the kind of life you want, to make the changes in your life and behavior that you need to live the life you want. Join me on this safari where I'm the tour guide and the savannah is you. You won't be disappointed. Chapter 1. Why we don't change and how we can. A model of the mind. The following page provides a useful model of the mind. This isn't a medical model. You can't lay this over a map of the brain and say, here's the amygdala, here's the prefrontal cortex. It's not a model that psychologists or neuroscientists would use to talk to each other about how the brain works. It's more of an analogy, a visualization, a model to help us talk about how the mind works. And it gives us a place to begin our discussion. Let us start over on the right side with the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind is that part of our brain that comes pre-programmed, the part that controls our body, that knows how to digest food, the part that knows how to oxygenate our blood, to fight off infections, knows how to regulate our core temperature. We don't learn how to digest food, we just do it. It's also where our deepest instincts lie, like the fight, flight, freeze instinct, or when babies react to loud noises, or startle if they think they're falling. That's not something babies learn, they just are born that way. Since it comes pre programmed, there's not a whole lot of change that can happen in this part of the brain. The scope of change is really very limited. You've probably heard of Dr. Ivan Pavlov, a Russian scientist in the first half of the 20th century, now most famous for training dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell. Through his studies on animals and humans, he developed the idea of classical conditioning, shaping animals and sometimes people's behavior, and even their unconscious physical responses, using reward and punishment, and observing how this dynamic shapes so much of our lives. This is still a popular and effective model for understanding human behavior and how we shape or change it. In Pavlov's footsteps is a long line of American behaviorist psychologists. Prominent among them is B.F. Skinner, who believed humans to be more or less a series of conditioned responses. This is a comfortable conviction for evidence-based theorists because it models the mind as mechanistic, a complicated repertoire of levers and gears, which makes behavior and psychology objectively testable, at least in the lab. Real life is often less clear-cut. This mechanistic conception, however, might be reflecting the phenomena I'm locating in the unconscious mind. What I'm calling the unconscious, though, is the pre-programmed, innate, instinctual, genetic material, behaviors, operations, responses, reflexes, that enables our bodies to function and survive, honed over billions of years of evolution. Since the scope of change in the unconscious isn't really that great, we don't typically spend much time therapeutically trying to change it. The reason I bring it up in this context is because oftentimes the subconscious uses the unconscious to communicate with us. Because the subconscious is below conscious awareness, sub equals below, there's not a way for it to directly break through and communicate directly with the conscious mind. So, oftentimes, what it'll do is use our unconscious to create feelings in our body as a way of drawing our attention to whatever it thinks our needs, wants, and desires are. In common parlance, subconscious and unconscious are typically used interchangeably, and they mean roughly the same thing. Clearly, I'm using these terms subconscious and unconscious in particular ways in this model to be a little more specific about which mental phenomenon I'm referring to. For instance, let's say you're in a given situation and your subconscious mind is paying attention, as it always does, and it comes to the conclusion that you might be in some sort of danger. So it uses your body's brain, the unconscious, to create that pit in your stomach feeling, or that tension in your chest, or the adrenaline in your arms, or whatever feeling on edge or anxious feels like to you. And now you feel anxious. You get that feeling and you become consciously aware of it. So now you can do something about it. You can get yourself out of that situation or address whatever the concern is. The subconscious uses the unconscious to create these feelings as a way of communicating with us. When I work with clients, whenever we partner in this kind of insight generating work, it's always important that my clients feel free to feel their feelings. As adults, we're really good at having trained ourselves not to feel our feelings, especially if those feelings are uncomfortable or bad. We coach ourselves with sentiments like, oh, that happened a long time ago, or I shouldn't be so sensitive, or they didn't mean that, or that's just them, or I shouldn't take it so personally. Whatever the reasoning is, we try to deny it, or stuff it down, or discredit our feelings, or their justification. We teach ourselves to not feel our feelings, to not trust them. And this isn't just as adults. Most of us have been taught from a very early age that our feelings were bad. We were told, don't feel bad, or don't feel sad, don't be mad, don't cry, don't get angry, and so on. Over the course of our childhood, we learn the lesson that our feelings were the problem, that we shouldn't let ourselves feel the feeling. So even as adults, we deny the feelings. We ignore the feelings, we try not to feel the feelings. This is generally problematic in our lives, and we'll cover this in greater detail shortly. Even more so, however, it's unhealthy when we're talking about the work that we can do in hypnosis and hypnotherapy. We want to be able to really feel our feelings because those feelings are simply what the subconscious is using to communicate what it thinks our needs, wants, and desires are. In my work with clients, I really want them to be able to feel those feelings, to really hold on to them, lean into those feelings, because those feelings are data, information. All of our feelings are good in the sense that they're information. We'll be coming back to this idea in more detail, but it's important to keep in mind all of our feelings are good, even the bad ones, even the uncomfortable ones, the unpleasant ones, the ones we'd rather not feel. All of those feelings are good because all of them are information about what our subconscious thinks our needs, wants, and desires are. These feelings are like the end of a thread. And if we can just hold on to that end of the thread long enough, we can actually trace that back into the subconscious and figure out what at root is going on in there. And once we respond satisfactorily to that need, once we've addressed that underlying issue, then the feeling has done its work and it fades away. Sometimes we do this in hypnosis, but it's also something we can do in our everyday lives. It's a skill that can be developed and strengthened that allows us to listen to our feelings. They're telling us something important. For me, that's the important thing to know about the unconscious mind, or our body's brain. The subconscious is that part of our mind that, when we're born, is virtually empty. We start collecting experiences, and for the first 5 to 7 years of our lives, we are in a permanent state of hypnosis. When we're that young, we don't have any previous experiences to compare with these new experiences that we're having. So we just accept everything at face value. This is the reason I could believe in things like Santa Claus. Somebody at some point told me Santa Claus exists, and I had no reason to not believe them. So, okay, Santa Claus exists. This is also how we learn how gravity works. We just keep dropping things until we figure it out. It's how we learn how our limbs move, how language works, how facial expressions work. It's how we learn about ourselves. Like, I like lasagna, or I don't like lasagna. How we learn about our place in the world, about relationships, about how the world works. Our mind takes these individual experiences, these points of information, and connects the dots so we can understand the world and ourselves. We can predict how things are going to go or how to respond appropriately. We connect these dots pretty quickly, and soon our mind is able to gather enough information that we start building understandings about the world, truths we know about the world, what we can expect from it, what we understand things to mean. I put truth and know in quotes here because there's no objective knowledge in the subconscious. It's all subjective knowledge, just our assumptions, our conclusions, based on our interpretations about our experiences. One of the cruel but unavoidable ironies of being human is that we form most of our fundamental assumptions about the world at a time when we are least able to make really good assumptions about the world, when we have the least experience and understanding. We start building a bank of all these truths, these scripts, these beliefs and understandings. Then these scripts, these understandings, start to affect how we see the world. They shape how we encounter the world, how we process our experiences. Any new experience has to fit into one of these existing files, these programs, these understandings about how the world works. Sometimes we shoehorn any new experience into how we already understand the world to work. Now, at this point, I'm making the subconscious sound a little manipulative, but really the subconscious is an evolutionary adaptation. The whole point of the subconscious is that once you learn something, you don't have to relearn it. Like tying your shoes, or taking a shower, or making breakfast, or language, or facial expressions, or your spouse's birthday, or parents' anniversary, driving a car, language. Once you learn these things, you don't have to relearn them. You can spend your time and attention, your focus and your energy learning something new. It's part of the genius of our species. But what happens when one of those things we know to be true ends up being false, or maladaptive, or unhelpful, or even simply contrary to the way we want to live? How do we change those subconscious scripts when the whole point of the subconscious is that it doesn't change? That's the central question we're dealing with here. So hold on to that question for just a moment, and we'll circle back around to it. For now, let us look briefly at the conscious mind. If you're looking at the model, skip over the critical factor for just a moment, and let us talk about the conscious mind. The conscious mind is that part of our mind that's like a laser. It's super powerful, but only when it's really focused. Like a laser, we know that if the conscious attention gets too diffused, it loses a lot of its power and effectiveness. Through the past 30 years or so of cognitive science, we know that the human mind can only hold on to 7 to 9 pieces of information at a time. More than that, we start losing bits of information. We also know now that it's not just limited in terms of focus, it's also limited in terms of duration and volume. Attention energy is a finite resource that you can deplete, that you can run out of over the course of the day. It's one of those things that gets recharged when you're sleeping at night or just resting. It's why, generally, we make better decisions in the morning than we do in the evening, because we have more of that decision-making power. There was a good article on this several years ago when Obama was president. Apparently, according to this article, Obama only had 2 suits in his closet, a black one and a dark blue one. An interviewer pointed out, "You're the president of the United States. You really should have more than 2 suits." And Obama replied with something to the effect of, "I have so many decisions to make in a day, I'm not going to waste any of that energy on what I should wear. So I just pick one, and whatever happens that day, that's what I'm wearing, whether meeting a foreign dignitary or playing in the rose garden." And the article went on to talk about decision-making ability and how it was a psychologically limited resource in the mind. The energy it takes to make good decisions can get depleted over the course of the day or even a few minutes of stress. A lot of my weight loss clients really resonate with this idea. In the morning, they are committed to the diet. They have a good breakfast, they pack a good lunch, and then over the course of the day, because of crappy customers or coworkers, bills, traffic, kids, spouses, politics, whatever it is, they just get worn down. And then they're driving home, and it's as if they go on autopilot. And all of a sudden, they find themselves driving into the drive-through lane, and they hear themselves ordering what they know they shouldn't be eating. They know they're going to eat it because when the conscious mind has enough energy, It's driving the bus. But when the conscious mind runs out of steam, it falls back on all those subconscious scripts. And somewhere in there is one of those scripts that says, eat that hamburger, it's going to make you feel better. Or eat that ice cream, it'll make you feel validated, at least for a few minutes. And what makes this whole process possible, is this thing called the critical factor, or sometimes called the critical faculty. And the critical factor is not a place in the brain, it's not an organ, as much as it is a function of the mind. It is that critical weighing, comparing, filtering mechanism that takes any new incoming experience from the outside or even our own self-talk and compares it with all those things we know to be true. All of those scripts, those programs, those lessons and expectations that are so old they feel like the truth. And if that new experience corresponds with what we already know to be true, it passes right through that filter and goes into the subconscious mind. It goes into one of those files, and your mind says, see, I told you so. But if that new experience or information conflicts with what we already know to be true, and it seems significant, that critical factor will capture that idea and put it in a sort of holder file of contrarian evidence, with the reasonable expectation that if that file ever gets big enough, we'll have to reconsider one of our previously held beliefs. But let's face it, that hardly ever happens, because every tiny little thing that confirms what we believe is going right into those files, reconfirming what we already think we know to be true, what we're predisposed to believe. It's how confirmation bias exists. It's why prejudice works. It's an efficiency of the mind, an energy-saving maneuver that sorts things into categories of resemblance or association so we can understand them, or think we understand them, more quickly, more easily. The mind reinforces those over and over and over again. Hardly ever do we get enough contrary evidence to really unseat one of those previously held beliefs. One of the few times this consciously happened in my own life is when I stopped believing in Santa Claus. At some point, that file got big enough, the file of contrarian evidence. I started figuring things out. The kids at school were talking about it. I noticed that Santa's handwriting looked a lot like my mom's handwriting. Santa Claus' shoes looked like my dad's shoes. I started putting it together, and eventually I came to the point where I just couldn't believe it anymore. I had to give it up. So now I decide Santa Claus does not exist, and I switch out the belief. But now in my mind, there's the certainty that Santa Claus does not exist. And part of that belief, however, is the subconscious understanding that everyone I know and trust has been lying to me for years. What else have they been lying to me about? What about the Tooth Fairy? What about the Easter Bunny? What about when they said they loved me? When they said that I was safe? What about when they said that they'd come home at night? And my brain had to renegotiate all of those relationships to figure out what I could trust and what I couldn't. And that takes a lot of energy. And we're talking calories, but also psychological, emotional energy. It's almost traumatic in itself. That process takes a lot of psychological energy, so our mind learns really quickly that we don't want to have that happen very often. So the critical factor serves to protect and privilege everything we think we know to be true, essentially to keep it from changing, unless it absolutely has to change. Which brings us back to that central question. How do we change the subconscious? How do we reprogram those scripts, those truths, those underlying programming, when the whole system is rigged to keep it from changing? Now, there are typically three ways to change the subconscious. The first is through trauma. Trauma can rewrite the subconscious really quickly. Most of us likely don't need an example, but a somewhat humorous illustration from my own life might help. It was my first really bad alcohol-related experience in college. I was at a party, and a friend of mine had a bottle of amaretto. Amaretto is a sweet, almond-based liqueur. I'd never had it before, and it was delicious. Now, this was my first real experience with hard liquor, and no one had ever talked to me about sipping, and since it tasted more or less like a milkshake, I drank it more or less like a milkshake. And you can imagine the rest of the story, so I'll just skip to the end, where I am sicker than I'd ever been. I'm there violently retching in the bathroom. I thought I was going to die, and all I could taste was amaretto. And from that one experience, that one traumatic night, probably only actually about an hour and a half, but now, for the rest of my life, if I even smell amaretto, I get sick to my stomach. That file, that program, that association is deeply written in my subconscious. As soon as I sniff amaretto, I don't think about it. I want to throw up. Now, intellectually, I know that amaretto doesn't pose a threat to my health or warrant even such a reaction. But subconsciously, there's that experience. My subconscious gets the amaretto signal and connects it to that experience in college and says, "Whoa, I know what to do about this." And then my subconscious uses my unconscious body brain to create that sick feeling in my stomach so I don't go down that road again. Trauma can rewrite the subconscious really quickly. But it's not a very kind therapeutic technique, so I don't rely on trauma in my practice. More broadly than just trauma, we can actually point to any kind of emotionally charged experience. It doesn't necessarily have to be even negative. Falling in love is a similar kind of emotional experience that rewires our brains in surprising and stubbornly persistent ways. How many of us know someone who seems entirely unable to see the faults in the person or object of their love? Love is blind because we filter all subsequent experience through the lens of those first few associations we attached to that person. Many of those associations might have been created and cultivated long before we even met the other person, and we unconsciously glommed them on to our beloved. Our expectations or interpretive lens might be profoundly inaccurate, but it typically takes a long time and a lot of contrary experiences to crack the nut of our preconceived idea of who someone is. Which brings us to another way to change subconscious programming. The second way to change the subconscious is through a repeated, protracted experience, doing the same thing over and over and over again. This is what I think most of us mean when we talk about changing our habits. But this is also what professional athletes do when they practice the same layup shot or the same tennis swing over and over and over again. We call it muscle memory. But really, it is simply training the subconscious to do that exact, correct physical movement, allowing the conscious mind to concentrate on everything else in the court. So it's a very effective and legitimate technique. It works. The problem, though, is how do we not do something over and over again? It's kind of like asking someone to not think of a pink elephant. As soon as we read that sentence, we thought on some level of a pink elephant. We hadn't thought of a pink elephant for weeks or months, probably, maybe even for several years. But the mere mention of it brings it up in our mind. Even if I said, "Don't think of a pink elephant," all of a sudden, now we're thinking of a pink elephant. And somehow, weirdly, we have to push it out of our mind. Bringing up the thing that we don't want to remember actually causes us to remember it. Even saying, "Don't focus on it," at least for a moment or two, actually makes us focus on it. And we end up reinforcing the thing we intended not to reinforce. This repetitive strategy works. It's one of the most studied phenomena in human beings and human learning. It goes back at least to the Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov and his famously salivating dogs. This classical conditioning also dominated American psychology for 50 years or so in the wake of B.F. Skinner and others in the mid-20th century. And it's still a potent force in research and education. Because of this pink elephant phenomenon, however, it's only so helpful at unlearning subconscious beliefs. At best, we would only be substituting some new stimulus for an old one. And sometimes that's enough to solve the problem. But for most of our deeper issues, it seems like a band-aid that just leaves the underlying wound unhealed. A third way to change the subconscious is through hypnosis. Hypnosis is a natural state of mind, a phenomenon we experience many times a day, every day of our lives. It's really just a deep learning state when we are simply more open to suggestion. Hypnosis is what we call it when that critical factor moves off to the side for a moment and allows the conscious mind and the subconscious mind to interact and reprogram. You never lose the critical factor. It isn't ever completely removed, even temporarily. It's just moved off to the side for a moment, so it's not prioritized. Then, when you come out of hypnosis, that critical factor comes back in again, now protecting the new programming in the same way that it protected the old. And this happens to us many times a day. It happens if we're ever reading a really good book. And if it's a really good book, we forget we're reading a book. An hour could go by and we don't remember turning a page. We don't remember reading a paragraph. All we remember is the story. It's alive in our mind, where in reality, we were just looking at ink marks on a page. When I was newly married, my wife's favorite book was Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, that classic romance set in Regency period England. So I needed to read Pride and Prejudice in order to understand my wife a little better. I would read it at bedtime, when I was half in hypnosis anyway. And after a couple weeks, I noticed that I was speaking strangely. Throughout my day, I would say things that would sound strange, but I couldn't figure out what was wrong with what I was saying. One evening, I was reading the book, and I realized that during my day, I had started to speak in Regency period English. I had started to speak like the characters in that book, because I was in that state of hypnosis. While reading, those characters' speech patterns started to rewrite my speech patterns, and it was bubbling out spontaneously in my daily life, unconsciously, unintentionally throughout my day. And this also happens when we're watching a really good movie. Again, if it's a good movie, we forget we're watching a movie for minutes at a time. Now, it isn't as if it's me in the movie. It's simply that, for that time, that story is the only thing that exists. It is so good, we just let that suggested reality simply wash over us. Now, if somebody plucked us out of the theater and said, "You do realize you're in a dark room with a bunch of strangers," we would, of course, know that. If they said, "You know that's a two-dimensional screen. That world doesn't exist," we would nod. Yes, of course, we know that. And those people you see, those are actors who are being paid to say those lines that somebody else wrote. Yes, I know that. And the music is specifically choreographed to manipulate your emotions. You realize that, right? Yes, of course I know that. But I don't care. It's such a good story. I just let that suggested reality wash over me. For that period of time, because all those objections aren't getting in the way of us immersing ourselves in the experience as if it were true, we're in a light state of hypnosis. And what I love about that example is this. When we finish watching an engrossing movie and we leave the theater, we still feel like we're sort of in that world. If we spend a few hours watching Harry Potter, say, afterwards we still feel kind of magical. Or if we spend a few hours in a spy thriller, we leave feeling bold and adventurous, limber and exciting, and that the world is conspiratorial, fast paced, and exciting. If we spend 2 hours watching Star Wars, as we're driving home from the theater, part of us is driving down the interstate, and part of our mind is flying the Millennium Falcon. Back in 1999, everyone walked out of the first Matrix movie in an unsettled awe, curious whether they were in an elaborate computer program and how they'd ever know if they were or not. Because we were in a light state of hypnosis, that worldview started to reprogram our subconscious expectations about reality. Because we were in hypnosis, its influence carried on after that initial experience. But of course, those are all silly suggestions. We're not really magical, or international spies, or space traveling buccaneers. So those suggestions wear off pretty quickly. But let's say you had an experience where, for the first time in 40 years, you were a non smoker. And you leave that experience. And it comes time in the day where in the past you would have had a cigarette. And now there's two scripts playing in your mind. One that says, I'm a smoker, I better go get that cigarette. It'll make me feel better. And another one that says, wait, I'm a non smoker now. Why would I do that? Smoking is gross or disgusting or expensive or unhealthy or yellows my teeth or smells bad, whatever the reasoning is. Maybe all of them. Smoking is just something I used to do. And now you get to choose between the two reactions or behaviors. And the one you choose gets stronger. And the one you don't starts to wither away. And it's always easier to make that choice when you have a strong alternative already deeply programmed in there. That's what hypnosis is able to do for us. We aren't ever automatons under someone else's control. In hypnosis, we don't lose our good judgment or sense of morals. There's always a part of us looking out for our best interests. Once, when my wife and I were experimenting with hypnosis and exploring different styles and products, we tried a recorded direct suggestion session on abundance. And we thought abundance meant a sense of personal belonging and security, more along the lines of confidence and resilience. But the hypnotist intended to talk about money. My wife and I were in deep, really enjoying it, when the hypnotist mentioned wealth or money and started talking about abundance as an economic value. And both my wife and I mentioned after the session that it was at that point when we were both suddenly and spontaneously very aware of what we were doing and of what the hypnotist was saying, because it didn't align with what our values or expectations were. We had effectively emerged from hypnosis at that point because we were not open to the suggestions. When we want the suggestions, however, when they're in alignment with what our goals and intentions and values are, whether it's to quit smoking or to cluck like a chicken at a stage show, our minds are open to those suggestions. When we want to make the right choice, but feel like we've been hamstrung by old habits, thought patterns, or beliefs, hypnosis can help us reprogram ourselves to lean toward the behaviors and thoughts we want rather than those we don't. We always have the freedom to choose, but we want our heart to have our brains back, so to speak, and not sabotage our best interests. In another important sense, want has to be more than just in the conscious mind. Many of my smoking cessation clients want to quit smoking. In fact, they wouldn't come to me if they didn't. Yet most of them are also willing to admit that part of them wants not to quit. Even those who are steadfastly resolved to quit still struggle. That's why they come to see a hypnotist. Oftentimes, what clients discover is that they want to change. Some part of them sees that poor behavior as the right choice, as answering some need, as helping somehow. The task of hypnosis is often simply getting all of these disparate parts of the mind to be on the same page, to play for the same side, to lean in the same direction. Psychological research since the 1960s has revealed that what we experience as conscious choice is actually preconsciously or unconsciously determined before we ever make the decision. Some part outside of conscious awareness decides, sometimes as much as a full half second beforehand. And then the conscious mind experiences itself as choosing. Now, without exploring this fascinating and well-documented research, let us draw a preliminary conclusion that affirms how important it is to lay preconscious or unconscious or subconscious programming that facilitates our making the choice we want to choose. Now, in a real sense, all of these things that we've been talking about, trauma or emotion, repeated experiences, and formal hypnosis, are all examples of hypnosis, when the critical factor of our mind is open to receiving new information, essentially when we're learning anything. We don't typically call it hypnosis, we just think of it as being human. There are many ways to induce hypnosis: relaxation, almost falling asleep, boredom, anxiety, stress, surprise, overloading the critical factor with too much information too quickly, and so on. I'll discuss some of these in coming chapters of the book. It should be clear now why our minds find change so difficult. We are programmed, hardwired by evolution, to resist change. Our brains are designed to conserve energy, and learning takes more energy than already knowing. It is what confirmation bias is, why prejudice exists. How this was advantageous in our evolution as a species can be seen in a simple thought experiment. Imagine some cave people ancestors of ours, walking merrily along, when they come upon a saber-toothed tiger. Now imagine that there are two kinds of ancestors here. One carefully considered all the imaginable variables, the long and short-term ramifications and implications and possibilities of these options. Maybe this tiger is different than the last one. What would my spouse think if I brought this home? Maybe it isn't hungry. Which path should I take? Is a spear or a sling going to be better? Maybe the sun is in its eyes and it can't see me. And so on. The other ancestor went immediately into lantern consciousness, becoming uncritically aware of the situation and relying on instincts and prior experience to make a decision about what to do: fight, flee, freeze, or play dead. Get my spear up or run. Run! One of these ancestors didn't survive to pass on their genes, the calm, considered, critical thinking one, because they were eaten by the tiger. They took too long in careful consideration when they needed to act immediately. Our survival, in many circumstances, depended on the ability to suspend our higher thinking and rely on more basic programming. Those experiences or assumptions that are so old they feel like the truth. This ability to rely on prior experience is also advantageous in lots of other ways. We don't have to relearn how to tie our shoes, how to drive a car, how to speak our language, how to make breakfast. We are empowered by our subconscious mind to focus on more interesting things. It is, as I said earlier, the genius of our species. Now, it's present to some extent in most species, especially mammals, and pronouncedly among primates. It can be demonstrated again with classical conditioning, that Pavlovian dog trick, associating a bell with food and leading to salivation. It's also, however, frustratingly stubborn, as we've seen in recent years, highlighting implicit bias among well-meaning people who would never consciously be racist or sexist or given to wildly unsupported conspiracy theories. So all of the foregoing is to simply lay out how difficult it is for us to really deeply change and why. And also to point to the ways in which we can. For all our deep programming and hardwiring against change, we are also deeply wired for change. Change, adaptation, and the ability to incorporate new understanding and novel information is the genius of our species. It might take us a while, and we often don't realize that we're resisting it until we've already made the change. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, "All truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident." And this makes sense among individuals, as a society or a group, and also within individuals. We all wrestle with new insights and challenging points of view. At some point, coming to the conclusion that this new way of thinking is self-evident. Being able to shape that process, direct it, or encourage it to go in a particular direction or end in a particular place is the real task of learning, of self-work, of enlightenment. It might be what we mean by insight. Chapter 2: Resonance, the hidden hum of our daily lives. Have you ever overreacted? I mean, like out of the blue, lost it, without even realizing why you were so upset? Sure, whatever happened sucked, but at the level of anger, anxiety, fear, sadness, or frustration you felt wasn't really appropriate to how sort of bad that one situation or thing was, right? Sure, we've all been there. Some of us live there. This happens all the time because when we're responding to something in our lives, in the present or even in the future, we are reacting to every other time we've ever felt that way in our entire lives. We just aren't consciously aware of it. This concept is part of the discussion of the subconscious in the first chapter. Whether we identify it with the subconscious or critical factor doesn't really matter. Those concepts or categories are only to help us grasp the dynamics of what's happening and aren't absolute or prescriptive anyway. Another helpful way to understand this phenomenon is through resonance. A lot of us know the word from music. If a guitar and a piano are in the room together and tuned to each other, if I strike a G on the piano, the G string on the guitar will start to play, responding just to the vibrations in the air. That's sympathetic resonance. Of course, that has to do with the physics of vibrating air molecules in particular wavelengths that then vibrate the other G string. I can imagine most of us grasping the idea in metaphorical ways relating to our thoughts or emotions too. That idea resonates with me, or that scene really resonated with me. The idea that something that happens can remind us or make us feel deeply or connect us with a thought or emotion isn't new, but it's important to pause and consider the psychology of what's happening. Our subconscious mind is a vast and limitless reservoir of all our experiences, memories, thoughts, sensations, reflections, lessons, information, feelings, and so on. Everything we've ever experienced is in there, or at least could be, including our reflections on those experiences, filed away with other similar or associated experiences for easy and quick retrieval. But our conscious mind isn't nearly as vast or capable. As I said, our conscious mind is like a laser, powerful and focused, but narrow in scope. If a laser grows too wide, it becomes diffuse and loses that power. Similarly, if our conscious mind can only hold 7 to 9 bits of information at a time. More than that, and it starts losing information or becoming ineffectual. Its power is in its ability to focus. Our mind is designed to be efficient and streamline our reactions. As we read in the previous chapter, we don't have to relearn how to tie our shoelaces every morning, how to make breakfast or get to work. Our ancestors couldn't have survived if they had to relearn every time whether a saber-toothed tiger was dangerous, or a particular plant poisonous, or another human being a friend or foe. Our brain categorizes our experiences and lessons learned in a dizzying variety of ways, but all aimed at conserving energy, so we can focus on novel, interesting, and productive new ways of being. Resonance, in this context, is this feature of our mind in which a new experience that feels like or seems like something that is already in file in the subconscious mind is automatically associated with our previous experiences. All those feelings come up again, telling us what to do, how we should feel, how to react, almost always without our conscious awareness, since that would reduce the efficiency. We flinch at the incoming football. We slam on the brakes before we hit the kid running into the street. We warm to our lover's touch. We feel sick at the smell of amaretto. We don't think about these reactions before experiencing them. And thank goodness. This is generally a tremendously helpful adaptation. You can probably remember a time when this wasn't happening and how awkward it was. If you were like me, knowing how to drive isn't something I think about anymore. I just drive. But when I was learning how to drive, before the programming of where to put my foot and how much pressure to apply, how far or fast to direct the steering wheel to safely turn, and so on, there was so much to pay attention to, it was almost overwhelming, not to mention dangerous. If you have to think about the red lights on the car ahead of you, remember that it signals application of the brake on their part, and that in an abundance of caution, you should slow down also. And in order to do that you must lift your right foot off the gas pedal, keep the left foot where it is, unless you're driving a stick shift. Move the right foot 6 inches to the left and depress the brake pedal, but not too hard or too quickly. By this time, you've already run into the back of the leading car. Having these reactions and responses unconsciously, automatically programmed, is useful and life-saving at times. But one of the downsides of this extraordinary capability is that our subconscious mind, all those associations, files, scripts, and programs, is difficult to change, as we discussed in the previous chapter, especially if we're hoping to change them with willpower alone. Willpower is, of course, a quality of the conscious mind, a benefit of that powerful laser-like attention we can direct at things. Unfortunately, willpower, like the conscious mind, is limited in scope and duration. It is a finite resource. In short, we get tired and it runs out, often much sooner than we'd like. Have you ever tried to change a habit or belief by willpower alone? Even if you were successful, I doubt you'd describe it as an easy process. And if it worked for you, then you're one of the lucky ones. Basically, there are only 3 ways to change those deep, long-running scripts in the subconscious mind. Significant traumatic experience, like the aforementioned night in college chasing that bottle of amaretto. A protracted, repeated experience, and hypnosis. Hypnosis is able to work directly with that subconscious and intentionally rewire some of that programming. Resonance dominates our lives. It touches every emotion, every habitual act, every deeply held belief, every assumption about our world, good or bad. Most powerfully, because it operates in the background, we are very rarely consciously aware of it. Whenever we react, especially perhaps when we overreact, resonance is there, strumming our heartstrings. Which is why something so seemingly trivial in any other context can trigger such a disproportionate response. Resonance reaches back and assesses any experience that feels like that, sounds like that, looks like that, smells like that, rhymes with that, metaphorically and possibly literally. Our subconscious assesses not only those previous experiences, but all our thoughts, feelings, and conclusions, assumptions really, about those experiences. And all this happens in nanoseconds and almost entirely out of conscious awareness, because conscious processing would take too long, like slowing when we see the brake lights. Like the guitar responding to the piano, the vibrations of one note resonating in both instruments tuned to the same frequency, new experiences resonate with previous experiences. This is literally how we make sense of them. Without previous experiences to compare or contrast with or help sort the new experience, the new data is maddeningly meaningless. If you've ever heard a particular language before and then are dropped into a conversation in that language, then there's no hope of you having any understanding of it, unless you can resort to some shared pre-existing symbols or experience, maybe hand gestures, or familiar loan words, or pointing at objects, or motions, or so on. We automatically start looking for experience or knowledge that helps us make sense of what's going on around us. This is hardwired into how we find, or rather make, meaning. So we struggle along until we find a toehold in that new language or conversation or whatever new circumstance or context we find ourselves in. And that toehold is precisely something we already know, something with which we are already familiar, a hook we can hang this new experience on, or box we can sort it into. We need to find some resonance. Resonance just happens, for better or worse, helpful or not, true or false. And this is where things get tricky. Because whenever we encounter something familiar, we aren't just responding to it. We are responding to every other time in our lives when we felt that way. Every other time someone looked at us that way, used that tone of voice, made us feel that way, moved that way, whatever. So instead of simply reacting to this one person or circumstance, we are reacting to every time we felt that way. Every other time in our lives, for instance, when we felt belittled or let down or threatened or vulnerable or unworthy or scared. Our subconscious is saying something to the effect of, here we go again. I know what to do. I know how to respond. And we unconsciously, unthinkingly overreact. Livid, paralyzed, despondent, frustrated, crushed, whatever. All those previous experiences and feelings inform this one present circumstance. And sometimes we explode. And when we think about it in this sense, we aren't really overreacting at all. Our response is perfectly appropriate for a lifetime of associated anger, fear, sadness, guilt, frustration, or the like. If we could peel back the layers and look at all those previous experiences and programming, of course one would respond this way. Whether or not it's an accurate understanding of the present circumstance, the other person's tone of voice or intention, for example, that doesn't really make a difference at that point. Whether or not any of the previous experiences were probably properly understood isn't really a consideration. Realistically, how could we expect someone to understand perfectly and objectively all their previous experiences and assumptions, many of which were made before they were even old enough to understand the world or make accurate assumptions about it? Most adults find it difficult sometimes to have a more objective perspective or understanding or accurate perception about their experiences in the present moment. If we had the opportunity to really understand someone, what informed them and shaped them, and how they understood what was happening and how to respond appropriately, we would profoundly understand why they responded the way they did, or the way we did. It doesn't make the response good or even objectively appropriate, just understandable. And this isn't only retrospectively true. Oftentimes, when we are worried about something in the future, it's really an unconscious projection of all those past experiences into an expectation of that future event. Our fear or foreboding isn't about that upcoming speech or confrontation or first date at all, but really about all those feelings and experiences from our past. But we can't go back and examine the code underlying our reactions because it's all buried in the subconscious. At least, not with our conscious attention alone. One of the most powerful tools available to the human mind is the ability to examine and reprogram that background script or code running in our mental emotional operating system. It's the foundation of all psychology, in fact. How do we access, understand, and intentionally shape the subconscious? Because resonance is the foundational principle of how we understand everything, how we move through the world. The task of our lives is to tune our heartstrings the way we want, rather than however our heartstrings happen to have been tuned by experiences we didn't understand and assumptions we haven't had the power to reconsider. Willpower alone is all too often insufficient to effect real change in our lives. At best, we might create a new response or reaction through the brute force of classical conditioning, but this leaves the fundamental, mistaken, inaccurate, unhelpful programming in place. Or does it? Let us explore the dynamics of resonance a little more by diving into a specific feeling, fear, in the next chapter. I hope you've enjoyed hearing the first two chapters of Transformation, Transformation by Skoorsmith. Once again, you can find out more about me and my work at my work website, www.WholeHealth.Today. That's WholeHealth.Today. Today. Or my personal website, www.skoorsmith.com. That's SKOORSMITH.com. Feel free to reach out. I hope this has been helpful to you. Bye.